So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Allen. I'm the director of the Willson Center for Humanities and Arts and Baldwin Professor in the Humanities at the University of Georgia. And it is my great pleasure to host a Provost seminar this afternoon with my old friend and great scholar, Jahan Ramazani of the University of Virginia. I particularly want to thank our Provost, Jack Hugh, for all the work that he's done to support the humanities and to support research at the University of Georgia. He's made a tremendous difference to our work and our culture, and we're all very grateful for it. So Jack, thank you very much for organizing this Provost Seminar Series 2. You can ask questions at the end of our presentation today if you would like through the Q&A function. And after Jahan speaks, I'll have a brief conversation with him before we finish up. But if you do have any thoughts or things you'd like to share after Jahan tells us about his life in poetry, which has been so important to so many people, including myself, please do so. I wanted to tell you too about Jahan, and I thought, I could certainly give you the list of his great achievements, which are many: a Guggenheim Fellowship, Thomas Jefferson Award from the University of Virginia, that university's highest order, an NEH Fellowship, books that have transformed thinking not just about American poetry, but Irish poetry too, and someone I think has been central to the reimagination of William Butler Yeats in the later 20th century, which would be a great achievement in itself. But really, I wanted to tell you about friendship and mentorship, and about a positive sense of energy in the academy that Jahan has always shared. I first came across him in reading about Yeats and reading about Irish literature. His work spoke clearly in an interdisciplinary way across cultures with a great sensitivity, insight, intellect, and a writing of great clarity that we can only admire. And I was lucky to meet him afterwards whenever I worked in the university in Galway. And we had one magical day when we drove through Connemara and went to visit my old friend, who's now sadly passed away, the cartographer and artist Tim Robinson. I remember that day as a gift, and I know Jahan feels the same way about it as we passed Patrick Pearse's white cottage out there amongst the brown heather and the mountains. But it stayed with me, I think, because no matter what a senior, distinguished and brilliant scholar we have in Jahan Ramazani, and he'll tell us about that today, really, the motivating energy and presence behind all this is kindness and generosity. And I think that speaks to a great mentor and a great teacher. So I can think of no person better to talk about the humanities, to talk about poetry, to talk about literature, art, and society than Jahan Ramazani to give this Provost seminar series virtually at the University of Georgia. But we would love to bring you back in person in the future. But Jahan, welcome, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that incredibly kind introduction. And that was indeed a really, truly magical day. And it feels like today is yet another magical day that you're helping to make happen. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to Provost Hugh as well for this kind invitation. Here's that awkward moment when you try to share your screen and see if it actually works. I think we're going to be able to make it happen. Aha. There we go. So when Nicholas informed me that my assignment was to discuss the evolution of my scholarship over my life and career, I was both flattered, never having received such an invitation, and a little alarmed, feeling more comfortable disclosing the intricacies of poetry after all. Was I being asked to recite my own funeral eulogy? Well, okay, maybe not. I still sort of seem to have a pulse, but was I up to the task? Were my skills as a close reader transferable to reading myself? Although social psychologists warn that it's exceedingly hard to follow the Delphic Oracle's command to know thyself, once I settled down a bit, I welcomed the challenge, even if it meant putting my blind spots on public display. Could I grapple productively with a few key questions, namely, what drives my work? What has it changed? How has it changed? And what are its possible implications for those of you gracious enough to watch yet another Zoom talk this afternoon, one that risks ending with a how-to homily. It's a talk in 5 parts, and don't worry, the first part goes on longer than the other sections. Part 1, driving passions. One of the engines that's propelled my scholarship has been my unabashed love of poetry. Or perhaps to be more precise, I love reading and reciting, teaching, and writing about poetry of many different kinds. Why devote yourself to poetry after all? As a public-minded person deeply concerned about global conflict, racial and ethnic strife, social and economic inequities, why wouldn't I devote the precious gift of an earthly life to real world action instead of the stitching and unstitching of words? In one sense, the efficacy of poetry is nil, as the Irish poet Seamus Heaney conceded. No lyric has ever stopped a tank. Indeed, my earliest ambition was political life, before I realized, at least at that time, that the foreignness of my Iranian name and background were non-starters. As a teenager, I was exoticized as sheik or sheikh on the soccer field. I grew up in the rural South, the son of a short, brown, mustachioed Iranian Muslim immigrant with a strong Persian accent, Ruhi Ramazani, who taught Middle East studies at the University of Virginia, and an elegant, culture-loving, English-accented ballerina, half Zoroastrian Iranian, half British, Nesta Ramazani, née Shahrukh. From early on, I was interested in global cultures and politics. When I was a kid, my dad's fellowships took our family of 6 on years-long residencies to Beirut and Tehran in the 1960s. My older, hipper teenage brothers, that's me in the very unflattering pose in the middle. My older, hipper teenage brothers resented the constraints of the Muslim world, growing their hair so long, though it hardly looks very long in photos nowadays, that they drew the ire of religious fanatics who once in the holy city of Qom, threateningly surrounded our car, demanding to know if there were boys or girls. My dad, in his typical fashion, calmed the row by locking my brothers in the car while we went sightseeing for the day. Although aspects of Persian culture, like affectionate cheek twisting, put me off, the differences between our habitual assumptions and other cultural perspectives were strangely liberating. I thrilled at the different cultural worlds we inhabited there and on other travels. Once I was in high school, a career in the foreign service seemed the most likely option for an Iranian American with a love of travel, languages, and global cultures. Something happened on the way to signing up to be a diplomat. In Persian culture, poetry is woven into the fabric of everyday life. Quotations from 13th and 14th century poets like Hafez and Sadi falling effortlessly from the lips of even my poor unlettered relatives, such as this line, which I included in a page of my latest book, Bani Adam Ushoye Yekdigaran, Ke Dar Afarinesh Ze Yek Goharand. Inadequately translated as human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. Loving poetry's rhythms, textures, and emotional charge, I competed in my teens in statewide recitations, including a poem that took me deep inside a contemporary American poet's grief and guilt over accidentally killing his brother in a hunting accident. Also falling in love with the music of French, thanks to my thrillingly energetic high school teacher, Madame Liederman. I felt myself cast as the lead in a Moliere play. Yes, that's me, the buffoon who famously didn't know the difference between prose and verse. But out of costume, I knew that poetry could transport me into 16th century royal French court, medieval Persian Sufi wisdom and ecstasy, or the tormented psyche of a guilty American mourner. It was equipment for imaginative travel to other cultural worlds and other emotional states in which, as the poet Wallace Stevens writes, I found myself more truly and more strange. A poem, he says, stimulates the sense of living and of being alive. Poetry also drew me by its ability to encompass and mediate between contradictory feelings and outlooks. Crawling up inside myself to make sense of violent family strife between Iranian patriarchal custom and 1960s and 70s rebellion, I sometimes turned in my teens to the intellectual expansiveness and rigor of philosophy, as in Schopenhauer's bleak asceticism, to the perspectivism of Cubist art's discrepant angles of vision, to James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, kaleidoscopic narrative, and as a mustachioed DJ to jazz's layered rhythmic and harmonic structures. But while the mind-opening vistas of philosophy, art, the novel, and jazz have been mainstays of my life, poetry came out on top. Jim Marshall, my beloved high school English teacher, who later became a professor at UGA, changed my life when he helped me grasp the ability of poetry to say 2 or 3 or more things at the same time, especially attractive for someone who grew up with a divided or maybe even prismatic perspective. As I later realized, in a poem, St. Lucian could profess his love of the English tongue even as he cursed the drunken officer of British rule. An Irishman could hail the self-sacrificing leaders of the nation-inducing Easter Rebellion, all changed utterly, but question the nationalist martyr's wisdom. Was it needless death, after all? An American poet could coo with love for her dead father, but declare, "Daddy, daddy, you bastard, I'm through." Memorable lines, images, and rhythms kept coming back to me. Poems, moreover, joined thinking with feeling, the intellect with the senses, the everyday with visionary states, as Yeats puts it, blood, imagination, intellect running together. Along with poetry, another driving force behind my scholarship goes back, as I've already hinted, to my childhood fascination with the splendid variety of global cultures. Maybe that's not surprising for the son of immigrants, fumbled for hours with stamp albums and shortwave radios, pre-internet avenues to the sounds and images of faraway lands and languages, and who had roots in the Muslim, Zoroastrian, and via my mom, Christian worlds. My dissertation and first book took me to the Irish poet Yeats, introduced to me by a young, imaginative college mentor and then lifelong friend, David Wyatt, and studied further at Oxford with the Yeats scholar, John Kelly, and with Richard Ellman, eloquent, humane biography, whose Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry I re-edited long after his death. For many years, I came to see that Yeats, as an Anglo-Irish Protestant wedged between the cultures of the English settlers and the colonized Irish, also drew inspiration from West, East, and South Asian cultures, writing some of the most polyperspectival, multidimensional poetry of the last century. Since then, my books have grown steadily more expansive in their cultural and geographic reach, turning after Yeats to English, Irish, and American poets in this book, for which, as for all of my books, I've been lucky enough to choose the cover art. Followed in turn by a book on Irish, African, Caribbean, and Indian postcolonial poetry in English, the Hybrid Muse, which took and greatly expanded the reach of my interest in the in-betweenness of poets like Yeats and like Langston Hughes, who I'd already written about in my elegy book as crossing African-American vernacular forms with English literary traditions in a poem like The Weary Blues. Belonging to multiple worlds that are transformed by the convergence, poets from India, Uganda, Nigeria, Barbados, Jamaica, and elsewhere grew up in the potentially productive tension between an imposed and an inherited culture. Productive, that is, for the powerful literary mind that can invent imaginative forms to articulate the ironies and ambiguities of this cultural in-betweenness. I wanted to show that poetry, a genre rich in double-voiced aesthetic structures like paradox, irony, and metaphor, sight may strike you blind, writes the Indian poet A.K. Ramanujan. This equipment is well suited to mediating between and registering the contradictions of split cultural experience. I wanted to help internationalize poetry studies, showing how postcolonial poets dramatically expanded the contours of English language poetry by infusing it with indigenous metaphors and rhythms, creoles and genres. I wanted to show that a poet like Ramanujan imports the metaphoric compression of literary Tamil into English. The Jamaican poet, Louise Bennett, the phonemic wit and play of Creole words like Bunununu for pretty, or Buguyaga for worthless. The Ugandan poet Okot Pabitek adapts graphic idioms, images, and rhetorical strategies from Acholi songs. My husband's tongue, complains an Acholi villager, is fierce like the arrow of the scorpion. At the same time, such poets have remade the literary language and forms of the colonizer. Wale Soyinka grafts Elizabethan English onto Yoruba syntax and myth. Derek Walcott turns the Greek Philoctetes into an allegorical figure for postcolonial affliction. And Lorna Goodison adapts Western mythical figures such as Penelope to a Caribbean geography and history. An image from a more recent book I edited on the same subject. Informed by the hybridizing, creolizing, indigenizing strategies of postcolonial poetry, my next book, Transnational Poetics, which I'm happy to say I'm now writing the preface for in its translation to Czech, and also coming out in Chinese and partly in Polish. In this book, I try to widen the scope still further, arguing that cross-cultural exchange and migration are integral to the innovations of modern poetry, challenging the notion of a self-sufficient American English, Irish, Indian body of poetry. My subsequent books have continued to reflect this increasingly expansive range of poets seen as entangled with one another across lines of nation, race, and geography. Tried to establish that the postcolonial poetry of the global South has been enmeshed with the poetry of the global North, Eliot Yates, Pound, Moore, Merrill, Ginsberg, and others, and that the poetry of the global North, too, has been entangled with the poetry, art, and aesthetics of the global South, China, Japan, Persia, West Africa, and so forth. More recently, poetry in a global age tracks the flows of the ingredients making up poems across national borders. In doing so, it tries out a series of different approaches, drawing on world literature, tourism studies, global history, cultural geography, eco-cosmopolitanism, translation theory, and a wide range of examples that illuminate poetry's, I hope, it's poetry's globality, how even when it seems singularly rooted in localities and nations, its long memory of forms and words, its capacity for radial connections across centuries and continents and languages, make it a powerful imaginative resource for our global age. What could be more exciting than thinking about how poetic techniques, vocabularies, and even poetic forms like the ghazal, the sonnet, and haiku migrate from and are transplanted and remade in entirely new cultural habitats. Although I thought I was rebelling against my father's social scientific mindset by plunging into literary studies, aesthetics, form, art, rather than poli-sci, I guess he's had the last laugh as my work has become increasingly devoted to poetry's global dimensions. So that was part one, about the love. Part two, irritation. As I say, I've been talking about where my love of poetry and of global cultures came from. But as my mention of rebellion suggests, love may not always be enough in itself to generate scholarship. At least in my experience, there has to be some grit, some resistance, some irritation to set the wheel in motion. I hope the love in my case comes through in my work's close engagement with the nuances of poems, their linguistic daring and formal inventiveness, and rhetorical power and historical responsiveness. But friction also fires scholarly endeavor. As an MA student on a Rhodes Scholarship in the UK, I was enraptured by poets like Yeats. Having been taught as an undergrad about the conflict of interpretations by a brilliant, open-minded theorist, Paul Armstrong, I was also irritated by the old-fashioned anti-theoretical empiricism then dominating literary studies at Oxford. Conversely, as a PhD student who returned to the States, I immersed myself more deeply than ever before in the long history of the poetry canon, but I was also a little irked by deconstructionist theory worship at Yale and chose as directors of my dissertation, not the biggest names, though I learned a lot from them, taking classes with them, but two poetry attentive scholars, Thomas Whitaker and Paul Fry. Out of those opposing pushes and pulls at Oxford and Yale and elsewhere was born my own literary approach, deeply committed to close reading of the cross-cultural and intricacies and complexities of poetry as illuminated by, but not confined by theory. The coupling of affection with frustration has been productive, at least for me, I hope. What, for example, is the source of irritation driving my most recent book on poetry in a global age? Well, at the broadest level, it's the anti-globalist intensification of xenophobic nationalisms and nativisms in the US and many other parts of the world. Within the academy, it's the disregard for poetry in the newly emergent novel-heavy field of world literary studies, a field that in some hands has tended toward the reductiveness of distant reading and economic determinism. Maybe the most powerful form of irritation as a creative force has been, frankly, irritation with myself. Time and again, I found myself rebelling against the inadequacies of my own earlier work, even if by doing so, I just compound the inadequacies. In my most recent book, Poetry in a Global Age, for example, you can see that I chose the same artist for those two covers to indicate the close link between these two books, even as one revised the other. I branched out into areas I hadn't worked in before. I was being pleased that by Transnational Poetics having won a book prize, but irked by my failure in it to grapple enough with poetry in different languages and with questions of its translatability. My failure to enter dialogue with the new field of world literature. My failure to bring eco-poetics into my approach to the globality of poetry, especially as we find ourselves hurtling possibly toward the brink of ecological catastrophe. Similarly, Transnational Poetics was motivated by a dissatisfaction with my having studied in my previous books, First World Anglophone poetry, Irish, English, American, largely separately from the postcolonial poetry of Africa, India, and the Caribbean, despite their enmeshment. Another recent book of mine, Poetry and Its Others, which examines how poetry flourishes in a perpetual dialogue with other genres that it draws on and also pushes back against, like song, prayer, the news, philosophy, the novel, and the law. It was no doubt partly written in irritation with critics like me who write about poetry as if it were an echo chamber, perpetually involved with itself, exploring an array of poets from Gerard Manley Hopkins, Yeats, T.S. Eliot, and William Carlos Williams to Frank O'Hara, Paul Muldoon, Bessie Phillip, and many others. I tried to show how poetry defines itself with and against its others, the realism of the novel, and the news's empiricism, the abstractions of theory, and the law's social ordering, the ritualism of prayer, and the voice-ingrained melodies of song. As this painting I chose for the cover was meant to suggest, even as poetry stretches to incorporate various genres, it puts on display the compression, dense figuration, self-reflexivity, and sonic and visual form by which it differentiates itself from the others it metabolizes. Mind you, it's true that poetry, as I've already suggested, is a language that has a long memory of itself. My first two books were about poems of mourning or rather elegies, and such poems tend to be especially self-conscious of their debts to earlier poems. But as I began to show in my elegy books, they also at the same time push back against obituaries, religious texts, funeral sermons, condolence cards, bereavement psychology, visual memorials, and other discourses that oversimplify or standardize mourning for the dead. The book I'm writing now on elegy on a global scale brings together my elegy scholarship with my efforts at literary transnationalism. It reacts against the seclusion of elegy criticism within national linguistic canon, including my own focus on the English language modern elegy. I hope to show the astonishing confluences and convergences of elegies written by bereaved poets in different times, different places, different languages, poets such as those mourning the deaths of their children in Persian, Arabic, Russian, Japanese, Bengali, Italian, French, German, Polish, and Old English from at least the Middle Ages to today. Part 3, Poetry and Grief. By now, as you've probably noticed, I've strayed beyond poetry generally and globality as well into a major sub-area of my scholarship, poetry of mourning or elegy. Literary critics sometimes express surprise when they meet me, and I'm a relatively jovial sort of a person, given that I've written so much about poetry of death, grief, and loss. Maybe though it's because poetry often heightens the awareness of mortality, that I'm all the more alive to the pains and pleasures renewed by poetry, again citing Wallace Stevens' passions of rain or moods in falling snow or unsubdued elations when the forest blooms. This for a poet who declares death is the mother of beauty. Why have I been so obsessed with the elegy from the start of my career to today? Well, some of the inspiration may have to do, again, with my in-between cultural experience, one foot in Persian culture, the other, Persian culture in which the displays of mourning are intense, protracted, public, some would say histrionic. During the 40-day ritual mourning period after a death. And another foot in modern Anglo-American culture, in which, as social anthropologists have observed, mourning's been largely privatized. Death and dying have been relegated to hospitals as a medical issue, the failure to keep the body alive. As a reader, I kept noticing that modern poetry had become a crucial space for plumbing the deeply human experience of mourning the dead. Contrast to the pop psychological restriction of grief to 5 programmatic stages, modern contemporary elegies from Hardy to Langston Hughes, Brooks, Plath, and Heaney show mourning to be often conflicted, unpredictable, protracted, worthy of close, intricate attention and creative exploration. While we tend to think of scholarship as affectively neutral, I've been realizing increasingly that my work on elegy is in some ways a continuation by other means of the poet's work of mourning. When Heaney writes of his mother's death, space we stood around had been emptied into us to keep. It penetrated clearances that suddenly stood open. That space of her loss has also been emptied into us. Grief can be so powerfully and memorably articulated that it survives across languages. As in an example I've been writing about recently, a 13th century elegy by, again, the Persian poet Sa'di for his son is translated and commented on in late 16th century Ottoman Turkish, then transmuted into, also very hard for me to decipher, early 19th century German, to make its ways into the hands of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who he says, frantic, tottering, void of wit, obsessively retranslated a 600-year-old Muslim elegy as a way of wrestling with the loss of his own 5-year-old son, Waldo. I've been returning to the subject ever since a beloved, brilliant, beautiful first cousin of mine, Farshad Mir-Aftab, was tortured and executed in Iran in the early years of the Iranian Revolution, an experience that weighed on me as I wrote Yeats and the Poetry of Death, and a few years later, Poetry of Mourning, a book I dedicated to Farshad's memory. Only years later did I discover that the cover image I'd chosen for the book, Kitty Kollwitz's drawing of a grieving mother bent over her dead child, was one of my cousin Farshad's favorites. Part 4. Gosh. Part 4, getting ahead of myself. The passion to learn, along with irritation and love, as well as grief that's a byproduct of love. A third impetus behind my scholarship has been the passion to learn. One of the great joys of being a scholar is that you're a perpetual student, delving into new areas, trying out new angles of attention. Poetry might sound to some like a small area, but as an associate editor of the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, co-editor of 3 editions of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and the editor of the most recent Norton Anthology of Modern Contemporary Poetry, aware of what a small fraction of the whole body of poetry I truly know, I feel awed by what a vast literary terrain this is. The wonder and passion that I felt have pushed me to cast my net, as I've been saying, ever wider over the years. My first book focusing on a single author, but by the time I was editing the Norton Anthology of Modern Contemporary Poetry, I found myself laboring over introductions and notes to over 1,500 poems by 195 poets. And this desire has continued to propel me into fresh areas of research as I've been invited to contribute chapters to books like these, and also to speaking engagements. As a keynote conference last year, I realized that even though I've written about the form here and there, I never really had the chance to dive deeply into the critical literature and the rich history of the form. And I was thrilled by discoveries of how African-American modernists and many other sonnets develop a rich array of metaphors for themselves: box, house, song, prayer, coffin, prison, closet, to postcard, nation, garland, even pathogen. Asked to write for this year's 100th anniversary of the most famous modern poet, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, I found myself rethinking it as an elegy for the world that has many resonances and echoes with climate change elegies for the planet today. Yet even as love, irritation, and the passion to learn have pushed me to expand my range and array of poems and topics and ideas, the scope's not limited. The scope's not limitless. The scope is indeed limited. In scholarship, as so often in life, you got to make choices. I learned this lesson most painfully as an editor. Even though one volume of the Norton Anthology of Modern Contemporary Poetry claims on the back that it's, quote, the most comprehensive anthology of modern poetry in English, and the other volume that is the only comprehensive annotated anthology of contemporary poetry, the truth is, comprehensiveness is an illusion. I had to leave out many more poems than I could possibly include. Even the most inclusive anthology and mine have brought in many more postcolonial, experimental and poets of color. Even an anthology like that's also bound to exclude. Why? Because every time you pick a poem, you're saying, this is a poem that's especially worthy. Because space limitations of a physical book, even if in 2 volumes, can only contain so much. Because copyright makes it too expensive to include all the poems you might want. And indeed, nearly 2 decades later, we're still paying off the $500,000 in permissions fees for the right to reprint poems. Because even as an anthology can expand and reshape the field, it also has to cater to what readers want to read, teachers want to teach, or it'll be remainder. Finally, because even though an anthology may seem a random gathering of poems, etymologically a flower gathering, it has to tell stories, or perhaps make stories tellable. As I've suggested in my case anyway, the increasing globalization of poetry, the hybridization of poetry from different cultural traditions, the persisting power of genres like the elegy, the sonnet, and the ghazal, and ultimately the extraordinary heterogeneity of poetry in various styles and forms by people of different races, ethnicities, social backgrounds, and nationalities. Ironically, even the story of inclusion and diversification demands certain kinds of selection that make poetry's expansiveness visible. So too, inclusive scholarship must choose certain approaches, certain topics, certain poets, and exclude others if it's to be coherent and reach depths and insights that will last, or if you're lucky, for maybe 30 years or more. All this said, I feel like I haven't fully taken advantage of this exercise in self-reflection to extract some almost embarrassingly obvious pearls of wisdom. What have I learned from my abundant failures and occasional successes as a scholar over the last 40 years? Foolish and risky though it may be to end in the mode of homily or how-to guide, here goes. And I'm going to stop screen sharing here and just go to my text. So here we go. 10 precepts for a young scholar, what I wish I'd known in my 20s. And unsurprisingly, number 1 is going to, 2 and 3 are going to be my trifecta. 1, embrace what you love as a scholar. For me, poetry, elegy, global cultures. A subject matter that's endlessly fascinating and absorbing is likelier than some fleeting fancy or dutiful obligation to stimulate work that's rich, meaningful, and enduring. 2, embrace your irritations as a writer. For me, provincialisms, ethno-nationalisms, limiting conceptions of grief, my own earlier failures. Treat them as fire for igniting your ideas in dialogue with other scholars, with students, and with your own earlier views. Did you get a reader's report or review or audience question that rubbed you the wrong way? Good. What can you learn from it about your commitments and methods, as seen from a different, maybe even hostile angle? 3, embrace the expansive passion to learn that brought you to scholarship in the first place. A cynical, suspicious, derisive outlook might make you look smart to some, but cultivating a generosity of spirit and intellect, a capacity for wonder and broad-mindedness, even if less cool, is ultimately likelier to open you to new access of human achievement and earthly experience. 4, learn from the best in your field. For me, scholars like Helen Bendler, Kwame Anthony Appiah, poet scholar Seamus Heaney. It doesn't have to be the most trendy or best-selling work, but as you get started on a new article or book, look at the work you most admire and, setting aside the meaty content, think about the bones of the argumentative structure that will help it last. Can you adapt and even improve on those strategies? 5, learn from your students. They can be great collaborators in helping develop your ideas. If you structure the classroom not as a space for one directional flow from faculty to students, but as a space that's for multi-directional flows, allowing for spontaneity, surprise, unpredictability of thought, the light bulb moments when new ideas suddenly arise out of the exchange of ideas. And the students too will be better for it. It's been deeply satisfying for me to collaborate with former students and young faculty I've mentored at other schools in helping develop and expand poetry studies. 6, serve your department, your university, and the profession. Without a healthy working environment, locally and across institutions, fostering high standards, mutual respect, collaboration, and mentorship, it's hard for one's own work to thrive. We have to give it time, attention, and care to the nuts and bolts that hold the academy together. And if, like me, sometimes go overboard in this regard, a spouse, a partner, a friend can help you screen the sometimes overwhelming service demands, tenure reports, manuscript reviews, external department reviews, committee work, professional leadership posts like chairing a selection academy for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, or being a member of the MLA's executive committee, so that you have time still for your scholarship and teaching. Indeed, 7, make time for your research and writing every day. Professional demands can become ferocious, but as I tell my grad students, if you schedule just even an hour a day on the busiest days, as I really struggled to do when I was chairing my department or chairing the faculty senate, both when my kids were little, still you stay in touch with your own thoughts and the ideas build momentum. During that sacred time of intense concentration, just try to turn off the distractions as much as you can, the texts, the emails, the phone calls, if maybe not the kids. 8, okay, I feel a little absurd crossing the line from scholarship to the life that makes it possible. Here's a suggestion that's hardly original, but I have to tell myself often, even when I'm insanely busy. Unless ill health or disability prevent it, exercise every day. Scholarship isn't only a product of the mind. It's likelier to flower if the soil's well irrigated and cultivated, and if the sedentary life's briars and vines are pruned back. No time, you say? Well, if like me, when you hit 60 during the pandemic, you absurdly began to use an underdesk bike, an underdesk elliptical, and an underdesk treadmill, though not at the same time, and indeed I'm using the elliptical right now, you can keep your heart rate up even as you meet over Zoom and write emails, recommendations, paper comments, maybe even write talks like this one. Number 9, again, hardly original and beyond the scholarly, but here goes. Embrace the love and support of your closest family and friends. My wife, Caroline Rohde, also a literature scholar who introduced me to Caribbean literature and has generously read for me an untold number of essays and lectures, including this one. I try as much as possible to reciprocate. And my children, Gabriel and Cyrus, who are pursuing entirely different areas from us, one in law school, the other in computer science and cognitive science, have endlessly refreshed and renewed me. One of the reasons I've stayed at Virginia, even when the Ivy Leagues come knocking, has been to help make a good life for the family and to stay close to my own immigrant parents, now just my 89-year-old mother, as well as the beautiful mountainous landscape in which my parents settled. After, I should add, a first semester after they got off the ship at the University of Georgia's law school. That web of connections, human, environmental, gives meaning to and sustains all the other facets of my life. 10, and last, finally, seize the opportunities for personal, emotional, and intellectual growth. We're happiest when we're taking on new challenges, developing new skills, trying out new paths and ideas, even if building on what we've already done. And it's never too late. 5 years ago, after my dad died, I began brushing up on my woefully inadequate Persian by continually talking almost exclusively and reading to my mom in the language. By listening to Persian stories and vocab on my daily runs, taking graduate level classes on Persian poetry, and recently, surprise, surprise, despite my imperfect grounding in the language, I recently published an article on Persian poetry as world literature, and I've somehow been invited to give talks to Iranian studies programs at Stanford and Yale. And brushing up on my rusty French, German, and Latin, I've also been trying to put them also to fresh use. It's never too late, or so I tell myself. Perhaps I could end my little pseudo sermon with a secular blessing, despite my lack of a mullah's turban or bishop's mitre. May your love of a scholarly area deepen. May your irritation turn into a fount of creativity, and may your passion for learning push you to renew and develop your scholarly interests for all the days of your life. Thank you.
You're a truly beautiful man, Jahan, and that was a beautiful thing to listen to. It's really you've given us a gift much more than we could have asked for or expected. So thank you very much for that. And really, rather than ask you questions or indeed have a conversation, I thought you might leave us maybe with a reflection. I'm struck today was Seamus's birthday. And also I saw Helen's name there, and I wrote to her about a month ago just asking how she was, and she's doing well, but obviously finding it hard with a quiet life in Cambridge after all those years of scholarship and community. And I wonder, just in finishing, and you've been so kind, I'm going to do my very best after this, if you would ever do this again, that so many more people at other meetings should hear this story. It was really, it moved me and educated me and reinforced in me that sense of view I had of that all those days long ago. So I'd say if there's a rule number 11, it's to be true to yourself all the way through, and you have managed that with great alacrity. But maybe you would share just one brief personal story with Seamus or with Helen or with a writer that you've spoken to, a conversation you had that stayed with you, and then we will finish after that.
Gosh, ah, so many stories come to mind. Let me think. With Seamus Heaney and Helen Bendler, who've been two of the truly most, luminous spirits and generous people I've been so lucky to get to know over the years. I guess the story that occurs to me with Seamus Heaney was funny enough when we were both in Williamsburg together, looking around at Colonial Williamsburg with a friend of mine there, Henry Hart. And he was just delighting in going to the various stations where you look, for example, at a shop where they have guns, and the gunsmith, if that's the right term, started naming the various parts of the gun, and you could see Seamus Heaney suddenly clicking as those words became possible poems. And then afterwards, I talked to him because I was beginning to develop this interest in kind of the transnational flows and possibilities of poetry. And I said to him, Seamus, you're treated so often as this kind of, deeply rooted sort of indigenous poet of the Irish ground. And you are that. You are this kind of, deeply rooted in the local environment where that I've come to love, and in Balahi, that area, and just it's lovely to see. But at the same time, I said, there are all these other things that flow through your poetry. Your interest in, for example, Scandinavian words and Old Norse words, for example, that flow into some of your poems, or the bog figures that are in Jutland, Denmark and elsewhere, let alone, many other things. And he said to me, well, so he said some nice things, and then he said, and so hilarious, because actually I think we're standing in a urinal as we're talking about before this, but anyway, before, and he said to me, it's interesting because I feel like I really found my voice first through an English poet, Ted Hughes, much more than through a connection with an Irish poet like W.B. Yeats. And it was just a wonderful kind of moment of sort of drawing out, and I just bringing to life some of these ideas that sometimes for me become kind of academic exercises, but he was really living that experience of the transnational flows in so many different ways, and yet again the deep rootedness as well.
Yeah, I was thinking of his poem, A Herbal, today, when he wonders where we will find again that land beyond maps and atlases, and it was in the back of my head.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I look at you in your office with your books and your map of the world behind you and your elliptical machine hidden under the desk. Things like to have learned something today. And I can't tell you how much I enjoyed and I'm grateful for that tour that you gave us, not just of your life, but of all of those social connections that preceded you, of the way in which over the generations we build upon each other and the great responsibility we have to each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If I may just say, I mean, writing this, thank you. You've given me such a gift to take the time to kind of reflect on that. And mostly what I feel as I reflect is enormous gratitude. I mean, I cited Wallace Stevens a number of times. I remember, when David Wyatt, that one of my undergraduate mentors, introduced me to Stevens, I just had barely a clue how to read them, but from him to Helen Bundler to my own personal growth owes so much to the scholars and the teachers and the mentors from high school and even earlier who came before me. And I hope, if nothing else, that this talk will be an expression of my gratitude to them.
I know, I think you're true to the chorus, which goes back to the very beginnings of literature and communities. So bless you for that. And thank you, Jahan, so very much. So I know everyone who's watching here is clapping in their living rooms, wherever they are. And this is recorded and archived and will be shared with many people. But thank you again so very much.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been thrilling and delightful for me.
Thank you, everyone.